I love Facebook and hate Facebook at the same time. Occasionally, something really great comes along. And I saw something this week that just made me think about Easter moments. Because the children are with us, I thought it was appropriate to start the sermon with it. This is all about joy, Easter joy. Scripture says that all creation groans, waiting for the fulfillment of the promise of Jesus. And there, in that moment, with those animals playing like we forget to do, I just saw resurrection. So will you pray with me? God of all, thank you for new life. Thank you for play. Thank you for love. Thank you for all those things that transform our world. May we listen for your words. Amen. So I started with that animal video, but I have an animal story too, and it's really a resurrection story. And it's about this dog that I used to have. Her name was Jem. And she was a little toy poodle, like really quite a tiny little thing. Kind of prissy in a way, I must say, as she pranced around. And at one point we were living in a place that didn't allow pets. And so I asked my mother and my father, I always say my mother because I don't know why, but he was there too. He did the feeding. If they could take Jem so that she would be available for us when we wanted to visit her. And so over the years, like my parents had her for probably 4 years. By the time we could have a pet again, it was her dog, not mine. I just felt like I couldn't take it away from her. Because the dog used to jump up on a pillow and sit on her lap like all night. And my dad, who had retired, would very carefully prepare the food for her. And, it was like this little dog was their baby. So at one point, my eldest son, he was mowing the lawn over at my parents' house. And I was actually at a conference. And I got this text message. Jem is dead. Mom is crying. I'm like, okay. They're very cryptic. So I'm like, what should I do? Should I go? And so I went over to my mother's house. And there was Jem laid out on their deck. And my mother was crying, and she said, Jem really loved us, didn't she? And I'm like, yeah, Mom, she really did. And my dad was saying he didn't know what happened. She was sitting there. She'd been having some trouble getting upstairs, but she kind of made this horrible sound, and she went around in circles, and she plopped over. Now, my dad is a doctor, right? So he checked for a pulse to see if Jem was alive. Nope, Jem was dead. Put her on the deck, and then he comes out and he says to me, I think I'll just bury her in our animal backyard, because we have a hamster and a guinea pig buried there. He was just about to go get the shovel. And I was just looking at Jem, tears glistening in my eyes, and this wind just whipped up. And I said, man, that is a strong wind, because it's blowing that dog. And I looked again, and all of a sudden Jem got up. And she started walking around. And I'm like, Mom, the dog's alive. And Mom says, no. And I said, yes, the dog is moving. The dog is alive. And my mom goes, no. And so I go outside and I pick up this dog and she is stone cold. Stone cold, honestly. So anyway, I pick her up and I'm like, well, we need to go to the vet. And my dad, very practical, well, let's just wait and see what happens. And I'm like, Dad, the dog was dead and now she's alive. We are going to the vet. Which we did. And we found out she had a calcium problem like some cows do, you know, and they fall over and you give them calcium and all of a sudden there's new life. That was Jem. And she lived a few more years. But that was a resurrection story I will never forget. But actually, as great of a story as it is this Easter morning, what happened to Jem wasn't actually resurrection. It's what we call resuscitation. That's when your bodily functions have shut down, but through some intervention, this being wind, you start breathing again and return to life like nothing had ever happened. Your biology is all intact. And I'm not knocking it because resuscitation may very well be a miracle. It might have been that day. It sure felt like it. But resurrection is something different because it involves not just new life, but transformation. The empty tomb that Easter day was not evidence of a resuscitated Jesus. It was the symbol of the resurrected Christ, a glorified Christ, one who had conquered what was material and corruptible and of this world and was transformed into one that is incorruptible and eternal, that persists beyond life. That is the story we have in our Gospels. And that is more than a miracle that we can be amazed at and move on to life as usual. Because when you really grasp the significance of resurrection, the hope that is captured in that event, life will never be the same again. So let's review. When we last left the scene, I wanted to say Canoga Falls, but I didn't know how many of you would get that joke. When we last left Canoga Falls, Carol Burnett's show, years ago. Sorry. See, it's good I didn't say that then. When we last left the scene, Jesus had been crucified. And it wasn't just the passing of a good friend for them, because death on the cross was the most shameful way to die in the Jewish tradition. In an honor and shame society, you definitely did not want to be associated with anyone who had been crucified. It's not surprising then that only the women and what they call the one Jesus loved, the beloved disciple, was at the cross on that day. But for the other disciples who'd scattered, there was an added complication. Because Jesus had set before them a God and a world where violence was not the answer. Unlike John the Baptist and others who had preached that God would destroy the oppressors in an apocalyptic finish, Jesus had preached of a God who loved, of forgiveness and of compassion and of turning the other cheek. So for many of his followers, the threat of Roman crucifixion was enough to scatter them to various places, trying to escape being rounded up and having a fate just like his. But worse than that was the death of an idea, the lost hope, capitulation to the reality that in the end, violence actually wins, and you are either the hunter or the hunted. And there they sit, between death and resurrection. And in that in-between space where hope has died, with nothing left of their loving, inclusive kingdom of God. And then early that Sunday morning, after the Sabbath, some of those women who had witnessed the body of Jesus being laid in the tomb came to finish the work. And there they found the stone had been rolled away. There they saw the grave clothes in a heap. And there they met two men in clothes that glowed. And they said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? And their hope lived again. So they run and they tell the others who mostly don't believe. But Peter, it says, runs back to the grave and sees this empty tomb. But the text says he goes away wondering what has happened. He doesn't really believe what the women have told him. He's not sure what went on. And even at that empty grave, Peter has a choice. Does he choose death or does he choose resurrection? This past week, we saw another bombing in Europe, another in Turkey, and another in Iraq. We've come to call the perpetrators of these crimes jihadists or violent extremists. There is no excuse for this behavior. It is without justification. But there are those who rightly point to elements which contribute to disaffection amongst people throughout the Middle East. We know that intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq have made many in the region suspicious of Western governments. High unemployment and poverty, as well as displacement of people, also contribute to the social conditions that provide fertile ground for radicalization. It's an all too human response. When your world is turned upside down, when injustice seems to have won, when you have nothing left to lose, that's when you instinctively say, we'll all go down together. Or I'm going to take as many as I can before I'm through. When faced with a power so great they could crush you, violent acts of resistance sometimes seem like the only way to be heard, the satisfying but completely hopeless act of revenge. And this could have been the fate of these disciples. They were under occupation by a powerful state. Their leader had been executed after a mock trial that could find no wrong. The crowds at the crucifixion had taunted Jesus and chosen an enemy of the state to be released rather than let a nonviolent innocent man go. Religious leadership had also played some part in his arrest and trial. It would not have been at all surprising for some of Jesus' followers to join other rebellions who were turning to violence in the face of Roman oppression. But then, the resurrection. Jesus comes to them again, and that message of God as love, of God's kingdom among the common and lowly, the call to come together, to care for each other is renewed and restored. The power of that resurrection event is undeniable because this defeated and dejected ragtag bunch who were hidden and afraid found their voice again. They came out of their hiding and they began to proclaim that Jesus has been raised, that God has turned the tide, that sin and death have been defeated. Their encounter with a risen Christ changed everything. You could say this resurrection moment radicalized them to love. In the midst of death, despair, and disbelief, they chose to go on. They chose to proclaim. They chose resurrection. And I think it's a choice we still make. There are metaphorical crucifixions happening all the time, all over the world. People suffer unspeakable tragedies that threaten to derail life. And sometimes we give up. We choose death. We might keep breathing, but we aren't really living. We choose to stay in the tomb, to reject the gift of new life and transformation that God so graciously provided in that resurrection moment. But our faith calls us to sit between Good Friday and Easter and make a choice. Do we choose death or do we choose resurrection? And it's a question of utmost importance because if we choose death, we continue in the ways of the world. We go with self-preservation. We create enemies and lash out. We build walls that separate us, and we hide our true selves behind what we do or what we've acquired. But when we choose resurrection, we begin anew. When we choose resurrection, we are strengthened in the presence of the risen Christ. When we choose resurrection, we learn that even though the message of love conquering death seems naive and inconceivable, we are part of a faith that commits to living love as a counter-cultural protest. When we choose resurrection, we are in the presence of love so deep, so profound, so eternal that death falls away. When we choose resurrection, we are radicalized by love. I saw some moments of radical resurrection this past week. I read of a community in Nova Scotia called Pugwash. Pugwash has 750 people and 6 churches. So you do the math. Those churches cannot survive and thrive in a community that small. So they decided that instead of continuing to work with limited resources to try and transform the community, that they would join together to be a stronger voice. They held joint services this Easter to worship together, even though their traditions are so different. And in that picture you can see, sort of at the back, her name is Nicole. She was a classmate of mine. She's an Anglican priest. And I think his name is Bill, is a Baptist minister. They're worshiping together. She's in her robes, and he's all casually dressed. But that's the commitment they made. They all joined together for other important things as well. Together, they are sponsoring a refugee family, which was unthinkable by any one church. They chose this because they chose resurrection over death. And then I heard the story of a sister of one of our congregants, Verna Giles, who contacted polio when she was 2 months old, which left her permanently disabled. Life was difficult for her, and who would have blamed her if she and her family just gave up? But with a mother who was determined and with a spirit that would not fail, Norma would not be pushed aside or forgotten. She was educated. She had her heart broken like everyone else. She struggled with how she looked, as we all do. But she also insisted that she could contribute and be a part of all that goes on. And she got a job at Camrose United Church, where she worked for 30 years, I think. She advocated for accessibility to public services like the library. When they forgot to put a ramp in, she made them tear up the sidewalk and do it again so that she could get in. And she wrote a book about her struggles, which Verna gave to me, because Norma chose resurrection. But most powerfully, this past Thursday, the Pope washed the feet of Muslim migrants. The perfect counterpoint to those horrible bombings. A defiant act of love. He chose to be radicalized by love. He chose resurrection. So on this Easter day, we celebrate God's gracious, love-consuming death. We celebrate Jesus crucified and risen. We celebrate a community that chooses resurrection and begins to transform the world with love. Don't be discouraged. Don't give up. Because the Easter moment is not done yet. We can choose resurrection over and over again. And when we're through, it will be the greatest transformation this world has ever seen. May it be so.